Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and today I want to talk about 5 classics to read in spring. I did a similar video back in the winter about 5 classics to read in winter, which I'll link you to in the description box if for some reason you don't feel like reading spring classics yet. Maybe you're still cozily self-isolated at home under your blanket and you'd rather read a winter book, in which case check out the link in the description box. But today it's all about spring. Now, we don't really know how much time we'll get to actually spend outside in these troubled times, but when I think of spring, I always think of this feeling of unrest, this feeling of change, this feeling of wanting to make a difference in your own life. And I'm not sure if you feel the same thing, but it's about the time when I switch from my warm coat to my light jacket, when I really get this kind of drive, this kind of sense to start something new. And the classics that I want to talk about today, to some degree, kind of have that atmosphere, that vibe about them. So these aren't all necessarily books set in the spring, although some of them are. But they are all books that for some reason in my head I connect to springtime and to the associated emotions. You'll find the links to those books in the description box, as well as timestamps to the points in the video in which I talk about them. Let's start with one book that I recommend over and over and over again, and that is Howards End by Forster. I maybe just connect this book with springtime because I read it in the spring of last year. I read it, I think, in March or April, or maybe 2 years ago. And it seemed to fit into the season very, very nicely. This is an early 20th century classic, and it's set around the lives of 2 rich bohemian London sisters, Helen and Margaret. And they are quite settled in their routine and in their lives, but then a lot of things change, especially when they meet a family called Wilcoxes. Unlike the 2 sisters, the Wilcoxes are a lot more traditional, a lot more conventional, but also very rich. And the sisters, kind of through these relationships with other people, realize a lot about themselves, including the place that they occupy within society, and then how to break out of that place. So this book is probably the one that's got the most tenuous link to the springtime, but for me somehow Forster's writing is just so beautifully fresh and warm and floral that it kind of fits nicely with the spring season. Anyway, if you're after a kind of light but simultaneously melancholic read, something that's very heavy on the emotions, something that's very heavy on feeling, there's a lot of feeling in the book, then definitely pick up Howards End by Forster. The next book kind of has the same sense of fresh new start about it, and that is another 20th century classic, I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith. And I know I recommend this over and over and over again as well. And that one, in my mind, I connect more to kind of the early spring, when maybe there's still a little bit of morning frost on the lawns, but the first flowers are poking their heads through. And in I Capture the Castle, nature and the weather, it is a British book, kind of play a big part in setting the scene for the story to take place. This one is a diary novel, and it's the diary of a 17-year-old girl named Cassandra who grows up in England in the 1930s, and she too comes from a very unconventional family. Her father is a failing author and her mother is a bohemian muse, and her and her sister and her brother, they're just kind of trying to get by in this slightly wild sort of family setting. The big change in their lives comes with the arrival of 2 American brothers who buy up a house near the castle ruin in which this family lives. Like in Howards End, this book is very heavy on the emotions, very heavy on the feeling. I feel like spring is, I know it's a bit of a cliche, but it's also a time for romance and a time for love. And I Capture the Castle, like how it deals with that in what I think of as quite an innovative way for a 20th century classic, and in quite an unusual way. Cassandra is a teenage girl, so obviously her emotions are all over the place. And this book, more than any other, has made me want to go out into the countryside and explore the castle ruins that are dotted about the Welsh countryside like nowhere else. We move on to another, I think this is also early 20th century, and the next book is kind of the quintessential spring read. So this is the one you probably think about when you hear classics to read in the spring, and I'm talking about The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. It's mainly set in a garden. It is about gardening, it is about planting and growing, it's about flowers, it's about fruits, it's about nature's bounty. And the book uses nature's bounty as a metaphor for, well, I suppose for mental health in a way, because many of the characters that we meet in the book, most of them children, are really quite unwell and unhappy at the beginning of the book, and then they experience nature as something transformative, as something that changes their life. And even though I am one of those people who doesn't really leave the house unless I have to, which is a lucky coincidence in these times of lockdown, but I too can appreciate the idea of digging in the soil and planting something and making it grow and seeing it grow and then eventually harvesting it. And this kind of nature as the cycle of life metaphor, which, you know, isn't the most original idea, is just presented so beautifully in The Secret Garden that if you haven't read it yet, I would highly recommend you do so. Next up, let's move 100 years back from the sort of books that we've looked at so far, and I want to talk about a Jane Austen novel that I don't really talk about that much, and it is Sense and Sensibility. This, for me, is the most spring evocative of the Jane Austen novels, and that's because, again, it has to do with this feeling of departure, this feeling of leaving something behind and starting something afresh. In this case, the two main characters are sisters, Marianne and Eleanor, and they are essentially getting chucked out of the big old manor house that they grew up in, and they and their younger sister and their mother have to move to a much more humble cottage in the countryside on the coast. And they move there and they start their new lives. I mean, they consider it poverty, obviously not real poverty. They still have their manservant and their maid and a big house, but they certainly start their lives in more simple circumstances than what they'd left behind. And again, nature plays a really big part in this book, more than possibly in any of the other Jane Austen novels. Marianne especially feels very connected to the surroundings. She goes out picking wildflowers, she goes for long walks along the hills, and through these kind of simple circumstances that the sisters find themselves in, the barrier between the human civilization and the natural world seems broken down a bit, and that is of course also representative of the relationships that these girls build with the people that they meet in the course of the novel. So Sense and Sensibility, it's not my favourite Jane Austen novel, but I really do think that it's a wonderful springtime read, and maybe one that I'm actually going to reread this year. Or at least watch the 1990s film adaptation with Emma Thompson. That might be a good substitute for that as well. And finally, I want to talk about a book that's not a novel, but a fairy tale collection, and that is The Happy Prince and Other Tales by Oscar Wilde. When I say fairy tales, this is very different to your Brothers Grimm type story. Oscar Wilde uses the structure and the archetypes of fairy tales as a framework to tell a story. And the stories that are collected in the Happy Prince collection, a lot of them have got, again, this link to nature. I'm thinking in particular of one called The Nightingale and the Rose, which is actually set in the bitter winter, and the whole conflict is around this desperate need to find a red rose in a garden that's still kind of asleep from the winter. There's also a story called The Selfish Giant, which again is about a garden. It is about nature as, of course, a metaphor for life and for love and for human spirits. Like in many fairy tales, the cold and the winter is kind of contrasted to the warmth and the spring, and that contrast that drives a lot of the conflict in these stories. So I always find myself drawn to rereading some of the tales in The Happy Prince around springtime too. So these are my 5 recommendations. As I said, you can find links in the description box, and I would love to hear your recommendations for classics to read in the spring as well. Please post them in the comments. Also, I keep forgetting to do this, but I would also like to point you towards ways that you can support me financially if you wish. I have a Patreon at patreon.com/spinsterslibrary. You can have a look at it yourself and see if there's anything that you like. And I also have a web shop, which is cats and classic literature themed, and you can find that one at spinsterslibrary.com/shop. Other than that, let me know what you will be reading this spring, especially in terms of classics. Thank you for watching. Bye!